Guys, this is the second time that I've tried to record this lecture about the immune system. Originally, last week I tried to record it, and then at the end it told me something went wrong and it didn't save. So we're trying again. Hopefully, it will work this time. But you'll notice that my writing is already on the slides, and that's because I wrote it the first time and just decided to keep it there for this second time that I do this, even though it's the first time for you. But I'll make sure to talk about everything that I have written down. So, this is really going to be just an overview of the immune system. It's very, very complex. There are whole semesters of courses in college and graduate school that you can take that are just about the immune system. So, this is like a very surface level introduction to the immune system, especially as it relates to cell signaling, which we talked about before break. But it is a really interesting topic, so I definitely encourage you, if this kind of strikes your interest, to spend some time investigating it further, even if that's not until like next year or longer down the road. But um, you will need more information than this if you're something you're interested in. Okay, so first of all, I included my favorite immune system like joke on this slide, which is the T cell and the Mr. T cell. Um, T cells' job is to like start an immune response that's specific to specific antigens. They're able to recognize antigens that are actually yours because you do have a set of antigens that are presented on every single one of your cells. It's called your NHC. Um, but it also will recognize when there are cells that are presenting antigens that are not yours, whether they're like from a virus or a bacteria or whatever else. And we'll talk more about them in just a moment. Before I go any further, I definitely want to talk about the difference between a pathogen and an antigen because they're words that are often confused because they're both related to the immune system and they sound kind of similar. So, a pathogen is any agent of disease. That could be a virus, a bacteria, a parasite. It even could be like an animal. Um, it is the disease spreader. Usually it's an organism, except for when it's a virus, or a prion, because those are non living things. A prion is a misfolded protein that actually acts as a agent of disease, such as in mad cow disease. And then an antigen is anything that your body recognizes as being foreign. So that could be a chemical, it could be a part of a pathogen, like a virus spike in the case of corona. It could be a toxin, or it could be something that's completely harmless, like an allergen that your body could recognize as a non self antigen. Your immune system is really good at protecting you from pathogens using a bunch of different barriers and also like both specific responses and non-specific responses. And it can be divided up into these three lines of defense. So the first line of defense is going to be things that are external for the most part, barriers that prevent pathogens from even getting into you. And those are going to be things like your skin, but also the different parts of your skin, like oil glands, sweat glands, um, all of those different things that are actually like part of your skin that are really helpful in preventing disease. Same thing with like your tears, in your saliva, you have enzymes that help with this. You have in the flu video, you saw like her nose hairs really helped with this. And then also the like acidity of your stomach is an example of this too. Even though you don't think of your stomach as being an external barrier, it actually is because you can think about your body as like a donut where what you see on someone is like the outside of the donut. And then the donut hole is your digestive tract. And it's like a very windy donut hole, but it is. So technically it is also a external barrier for pathogens to prevent them from getting into your actual body. And then after that, you have a second line of defense, which is just going to be a very general attack mostly by phagocytes, which are cells whose job it is to eat invaders. There's many different types: neutrophils, monocytes, cells called natural killer cells that will just like spray a toxic chemical over everything that's infected, and it will even kill like your own cells. Um, and then also eosinophils, which are responsible for fighting off parasitic worms. Hopefully, you never need to use them. And dendritic cells, which will be responsible for sort of stimulating that third line of defense, which will be the T and B cells. But the second line of defense is non-specific, so it will respond to any sort of invasion that happens, and it will include also the immune response, the like general immune response. Finally, if you need it, then you have a third line of defense that happens, which is your T cells and your B cells, which are so named because of the location where they mature in the body. So T cells mature in your thymus, which is a gland, and B cells mature in the bone marrow. Both of them are types of white blood cells. They are all originally are like born in the bone marrow. T cells and B cells are going to be responsible for fighting and remembering very specific pathogens. You have memory versions of both of these cells. In general, T cells are going to be responsible for killing infected cells, and B cells are going to be responsible for neutralizing the pathogen using antibodies. And that's called the humoral response. Okay, that was the overview. And now we're going to go a little bit deeper. All right, so you can also separate these lines of defense into the innate immunity and adaptive or acquired immunity. Your first and second lines of defense are going to be considered to be innate, which means that you're born already being able to do these things for people who are not immunocompromised. They're going to be nonspecific, and they're going to involve like receptor proteins and bind molecules that are specific to any pathogen. Their job is just to recognize things that aren't supposed to be there. And it will like have a big range of effects regardless of what pathogen it is. For adaptive or acquired immunity, that's the T and the B cells that are very specifically attacking or recognizing a certain pathogen, whether it's a flu virus or a salmonella bacteria or whatever sort of pathogen it is. This is why typically you do not get the same infection twice unless the infection has mutated. And that is why it's called acquired, because you have to be exposed to that pathogen in order to acquire the immunity. All right. This is just a nice diagram that shows some of the different cells of the immune system and whether they're involved in the innate immune response or the adaptive immune response. So you can see they all are kind of evolved from or descended from the same type of stem cell, which are all, it's like the ancestor of all the white blood cells of your body. And you have your innate immune response, which includes these different, mostly phagocytes that are going to be responsible in that second line of defense. And then also the adaptive or acquired immune system cells that are the T cells and the B cells. You have different types of each of those. For the B cells, the plasma cells are what's going to actually be secreting the antibodies. And then the memory cells are going to be responsible for obviously remembering that pathogen and remembering what antibodies to use. For T cells, you have memory ones that are going to, again, be responsible for remembering that certain pathogen. And then you also have cytotoxic T cells who are going to be responsible for like doing the actual killing of infected cells, and helper T cells who are going to activate other T cells and also activate B cells in the process. Okay, let's keep going. All right, so let's talk about the inflammatory response, which is considered to be part of your innate immune system. So it's non-specific. This is going to be started by molecules that are released when you become injured or infected. Um, they are chemicals that are going to be released by macrophages, which are really big cells who also can be responsible for eating, and they're also phagocytes, so eating and digesting different parts of invaders. But they can also release cytokines, which are chemicals that will trigger neutrophils to come to the site of infection. And you'll see in just a second a little video that shows the neutrophils like crawling along the blood vessel and arriving at the infection site. Neutrophils will actually like eat and digest the invader. At the same time, you have mast cells, which are secreting um, histamines. Histamine is a chemical that is responsible for dilating your blood vessels and making them more permeable so that neutrophils actually will be able to leave the bloodstream and be at the site of the infected, which is really important for them to be able to digest any like bacteria or viruses that got in at the infection site. Histamine might be a familiar word to you because antihistamines are things you take if you are having an inflammatory response to something like a bug bite or swelling or itchiness. Those are all things that are responses to histamine because when the blood vessels dilate, you get more blood to that site, which equals like heat and redness. And so you can take an antihistamine, which often is like a cream or an ointment that will help to decrease that. Um, Also, you have a set of proteins called the complement system. It's about 30 proteins, and they are used to help signal the immune response. Their job is going to be to attract more white blood cells to the site of infection. So you have all these things happening. You have cytokines, histamine, and complement proteins that are all together promoting white blood cells to sort of descend upon the area where you were either injured or infected. Um, because of the blood flow increasing, you have like antimicrobial proteins coming to the site, as well as the white blood cells, which are just going to assist in making sure the infection doesn't spread. And then, as a result of all these things, what you get often is pus accumulating, which, if you didn't know, pus is a fluid that contains dead white blood cells because they ate and digested the pathogens, and now they need to be removed to remove those dead pathogen parts, dead pathogens, and also cell debris from tissues that were damaged. So in the flu video, you might remember that when she was infected pretty close to the beginning, her throat cells started to die. And that was partially because of the natural killer cells like spraying poison over her throat cells. And that's what caused her sore throat for the most part, was those throat cells dying. And then they would have to be removed. And then also the last thing about this inflammatory response is that it could be local, which means a very small area, like let's say you had a splinter, that would be local, or it could be systemic, which can be really, really actually very dangerous to the point where it can even cause death, which would be septic shock. Um, but all of this would be non-specific to the pathogen. It's just a general response to any injury or infection. All right, so now I want to show you a couple videos. I can't show them on OneNote, so I'm going to switch to PowerPoint and show them on here. This one is a leukocyte that is rolling on the inside of the blood vessel, and you can just see that it is a lot bigger than the red blood cells that are rolling. And the red blood cells are going to be moving so fast that they just look like blurs. You can't really even see them, but you will be able to see the leukocytes, which are white blood cells. Here we go. So just to summarize that, they have a specific glycoprotein that can latch onto the blood vessel wall when it reaches an infection site. And it would do that because there would be a specific receptor for that glycoprotein that says like infection, stop rolling and stay here. And then just to like tell you this, you might already know, but leukocytes are white blood cells. Leukemia is cancer of the white blood cells. So just a connection for you if you didn't know. All right, there's one more video I want to show you on this next slide, which is leukocytes rolling. Let's see here. Let's zoom out a little bit. All right, here it goes. Okay, cool. So that's a neutrophil. Neutrophils are the most common phagocytic cells in your body, and they would be responding to those like cytokines and other chemical signals that triggered them towards the site. But you can see here in this video like how it would do that. It's responding because of a signaling pathway that uses a G protein linked receptor, which hopefully like think back to before break when we learned about those. But that would allow the signal to be amplified, which allows the cell to actually be able to like move towards the infection. So there's your one of your connections to cell signaling. Okay, back to my slides. All right, here is a nice little image of a local inflammatory response. So again, this would be like smaller scale and just the site where the splinter entered the body. What you have is mast cells and macrophages who are both releasing those signaling molecules. For the macrophages, that would be the cytokines. And for the mast cells, that is the histamine. So the histamine is causing the blood vessels to dilate, which means like the cells that make up the blood vessel walls are going to spread apart a little bit. So there's gaps in between. And then you can see in the second half of this picture, the neutrophils are able to squeeze through those gaps and enter the tissue where the infection is happening. So they're able to start to digest that pathogen, looks like a bacteria, that is present at the site of the splinter. Yeah. All right, so some overall like whole body inflammatory responses include most famously fever, which is a whole systemic inflammatory response that is triggered by macrophages releasing, again, more chemical signals that are received by target cells throughout the body. This elevated temperature is actually adaptive because it increases the rate of phagocytosis, which is eating and digesting the pathogens, and also can help speed up tissue repair. So the fever is actually a symptom that is your body trying to get rid of this pathogen faster. And it talked about that briefly in the video about the flu also. At the same time, though, of course, having a really high fever for an extended period of time is super dangerous because it can start to denature your enzymes and other important proteins in your body and lead to death. So it is a way that your body is trying to fix the problem, but it can result in like putting you way too far out of homeostasis, which can lead to death. Also, another example is septic shock. This is just an overwhelming whole body inflammatory response that happens sometimes when people are given transplants or tissues that are from a donor, including like a blood transfusion. So the body recognizes that that organ or blood or tissue is not of the person whose body it is, and so has this inflammatory response where it starts to attack the tissue or the blood. This is why people who are transplant recipients are on immune suppressing medications, sometimes for the rest of their lives. And sometimes people who are receiving transplants also will have a chemotherapy treatment before they undergo this transplant, because chemotherapy suppresses the immune system as well. And then also just chronic inflammation can be a threat to overall health. Um, Chronic inflammation can be caused by any number of things, including things like stress. So it's really important just to be aware of that and get inflammation looked at and treated before it becomes like a chronic, long-lasting issue. All right, now let's talk about how your immune system is able to remember different pathogens. So now we're talking about the third line of defense, the T cells and the B cells, and this is also related to your acquired or adaptive immunity. So this is going to be responsible for long-term protection against specific pathogens. Usually it's due to a prior infection, but it also could be due to a vaccination or passive immunity, which would be something like receiving antibodies through the breast milk of your mother. But we'll talk about prior infections first. So what happens is when you are infected by something, you have what's called a primary immune response, which means it's the first time you've seen that pathogen. And so it's going to take a little bit longer for the immune system to go through its different stages and eventually end up with effective T and B cells that are fighting off that specific pathogen. By the time you have this again, or you're exposed to it again, you have the memory cells that are able to facilitate faster, stronger responses to the exact same antigen or pathogen, which means that sometimes you won't even have symptoms of the infection because your secondary immune response is so good and so fast. And then this can also last for your lifetime. It can last forever. Different pathogens are going to have different responses and response times, but in general, this can last a super long time. And then just again, mentioning that T cells are going to be the killers of infected cells that are presenting non-self antigens. And B cells are going to be responsible for antibody production and release. The T cells, their response is called the cell-mediated response because they're actually responding to non-self antigens and attacking and killing those infected cells. The B cells response is called the humoral response because it's antibody mediated and it's going to occur within the lymph. So it's going to be antibodies attacking pathogens without attacking infected cells. It's going to attack just that pathogen itself. Okay. Here is a diagram that shows you the difference between primary responses and secondary responses. So you can see in the blue line that someone was exposed to antigen A. Over about 2 to 3 weeks, they produce enough antibodies to respond to the pathogen. But they're not even producing that many antibodies. When they're exposed again on the 28th day, so 4 weeks later, they are having a much, much, much faster immune response to the point where they're producing way, way, way more antibodies in less than a week, super fast. So that's how big the difference is between the secondary and the primary immune response. And you can see also that the same thing is happening with pathogen B, that it's also taking a long time to produce the antibodies the first time. Generally, it does, depending or regardless of which pathogen it is that is the cause. Okay. Here's just a nice little overview of the adaptive immune response. So third line of defense. You can see what's happening here at the top is the antigen is, or the person is exposed to the antigen. Two things happen at the same time about. So the antigen is noticed by the B cells. but it's also taken in by an antigen presenting cell, which literally is a cell whose job it is to take in the antigen and then spit it back out and hold it up on its cell membrane and be like, look at this antigen. And it goes around to the other cells of the body, the cytotoxic T cells, the helper T cells, and it says, like, do you recognize this? Do you recognize this? Do you recognize this? And it's looking for a memory cell to be like, yeah, I recognize this. Let's fight it. If it's the primary immune response, then everyone's like, no, I don't recognize this, but I recognize that it's not us. And so they start to have responses through like signaling pathways and cascades that are like, okay, time to activate and time to proliferate, which means like, let's make a bunch of copies of ourselves really fast so that we can like fight this infection. So, like I said earlier, the cytotoxic T cells, their job is going to be the cell mediated response. So they're going to go around to the different cells of the tissue and look for that specific non-self antigen. And when they find it, they're going to attack and kill those cells, even though those are cells of the person's body. And they would have the MHC that is like, it's me, I have an MHC, but they also would be presenting the antigens from the virus or the bacteria or whatever. So the T cells are able to say, you're infected and we're going to kill you now. Sorry, for the good of the whole body. Also, you have helper T cells who will become activated by the antigen presenting cell. Their job is to bind to macrophages, which carry non-self markers from the cells that have been conquered. So macrophages would have eaten infected cells also, and they will have the antigen presenting as well. And then they're going to produce interleukins, which are chemicals that will stimulate the proliferation or copying of even more T and B cells. So basically, these helper T cells are going to activate more T and B cells. So now let's look at the T cells are doing their job. They're killing the antigen presenting cells that they should be killing. At the same time, the B cells are becoming activated as well by being exposed to the antigen. And they are able to be like, yep, you are not supposed to be here. So they will start to produce antibodies that are specific to that pathogen. The plasma cells are a type of B cell that will actually release those antibodies into blood and lymph. The antibodies will attach to the specific pathogen or antigen and neutralize the threat. Also, memory B cells will be activated, and their job will just be to remember that that antibody goes with that pathogen to stimulate that secondary immune response. You also have memory T cells, and their job is to do the same thing, to remember. For the most part, after the infection is neutralized, the T and the B cells die because they're no longer necessary in your body, with the exception of some memory cells that will remain living in order to remember the pathogen. So the second time you're exposed, you can skip all of those steps that I just talked about and go straight to activating the memory T and B cells, and they can go straight to activating the plasma cells and the cytotoxic cells. So it's way faster the second time. All right. So now let's talk about vaccines and immunizations. In general, vaccines and immunizations have had a really huge, very positive effect on the human population and their ability to fight off diseases. What they do is they train your immune system so that when you are exposed to that pathogen for real, you are able to skip the primary immune response, so all those steps that I just talked about, and go straight to the secondary immune response. So way faster, again, to the point where like you probably don't even feel sick or know that you're exposed. How they work is a bunch of different ways depending on the vaccine, which you guys saw in your COVID research stuff. But in general, it uses antigens that are artificially introduced into the body that generate that adaptive or acquired immune response and the formation of memory cells. There are a bunch of different ways this can be done, and there are always new ways that are being developed too. The ones that are for COVID that people are getting now, the Pfizer and Moderna, are mRNA vaccines, which you have researched about. So really cool. And that's the first time that mRNA vaccines have been rolled out for widespread use. It's not the first time they've been created, but it's the first time that people are actually getting the vaccine that is the mRNA vaccine. Vaccination programs have been successful in eradicating a lot of diseases that were huge killers of humans for a really long time. And I'm going to show you some examples in just a minute. Now, the unfortunate part is not every pathogen is easily managed by a vaccine because some pathogens mutate really, really, really quickly. The flu is an example of a virus that mutates pretty quickly, and we do have a vaccine for the flu that changes every year, which is why you have to keep getting a flu shot every year. But as you may have experienced, it's not always effective because there are so many strains of the flu every time. Of course, some vaccines are not readily available in impoverished areas, which creates this discrepancy between like the haves and the have-nots, and it's like an ethical issue that needs to be addressed. And then the other thing that's important to mention is that side effects from vaccines are very rare. They can happen, but in general, these vaccines have gone through so many rounds of clinical trials and testing, which I hope you could see in your research this past week, that it's really, really unusual for people to have huge side effects from getting a tested and approved vaccine. So just wanted to mention that as well. Here are a couple diagrams about vaccines doing their job. So the one on the top is polio. It shows annual deaths on the y-axis and then years on the x-axis. You can see that when the vaccine is introduced in the 1950s, late 1950s, that the number of cases globally decreases hugely, to the point where now polio is not a virus that we have to worry about. And for people in the 40s and 50s, it was a huge, huge concern and life-threatening, crippling virus. Now, pretty much worldwide, polio is eliminated because of the use of vaccines. Measles is the second graph. So you can see here that so similar deal with measles. It's a virus as well. And when the vaccine is introduced, the number of deaths caused by the measles virus greatly, greatly decreases. This is an example where you see that in developed countries, you have really high, almost 100% eradication of measles, and in more developing countries, it's still more of a concern. So this is an example of sort of that discrepancy of poverty and its effect on health. You also see in the 90s a little peak of measles coming back. Part of that can be attributed to people choosing not to get their vaccines. And when you are around a bunch of people who choose not to get their vaccines, then the risk of you getting it and spreading it is larger. When you choose to not get a vaccine, you are basically trusting that all the other people around you have gotten their vaccines and so will not spread you the disease. You're just kind of like putting your faith in that. So I strongly recommend getting your vaccines. Of course, it's a personal decision, but generally speaking, the risks are very low and the benefits are immense. All right, almost done. I talked about this briefly before, but there are two types of immunity or ways to gain immunity for acquired immunity. And that's active, which means that either a pathogen or a vaccine prompts an immune response so that you have been exposed, whether you were sick or not, and you have memory cells that are responsible for handling that pathogen. Passive immunity is when antibodies are passed from one animal to another. The most common example of that is through breast milk um, to the offspring or in blood from the placenta. So mothers can pass immunity to their babies and they will never have to be sick to get that immunity. It is possible and it does happen that the immune system can reject transplants and transfusions, which I talked about again briefly before. Um, to minimize this, doctors use a donor that matches really closely the MHC molecules of the recipient. The MHC is about 30 proteins, so it is not super easy to get a perfect match, unless you have like an identical twin. But for the most part, your family members are pretty close in their MHC proteins. So that's good news if you ever need a transplant or a transfusion. For blood donations, it's more related to the blood type. So whether they express those glycoproteins A, B, AB, O is no glycoproteins on the surface of the blood cell, and then also positive or negative. Positive means they have the Rh protein, and negative means they don't. So um, that's why people who are O negative can give blood to anyone because they don't have any glycoproteins or the Rh protein, which is what would trigger an immune response. People who are AB can receive AB positive, can receive any blood type because all of those AB and Rh would be recognized as like self for them. Whether the donor is a really, really good match or not, the recipient will take medications, like I said before, that will suppress their immune system to help reduce the risk of them getting like shock. All right. An example of your immune system just doing too much is allergies. What happens is your immune system has a immune response to things that are not pathogens. We call those allergens. There are different versions, so you can have just a localized allergy, which would be like seasonal allergies. Um, and what happens then is your plasma cells, which are types of B cells, secrete antibodies that are specific for antigens on pollen grains, which is why you might have a more severe reaction to certain types of pollens than others. Some people have like really bad reactions to like ragweed or grass, but not as bad reactions to like tree pollen. Um, so that's why, because it's specific to the antigens on the pollen grains. When these antibodies do this, it triggers the immune cells in connective tissue to release histamines and other inflammatory chemicals. And those are your allergy symptoms like runny nose because your blood vessels dilated and like hot, scratchy eyes because, again, like more blood went to that area. And those histamines are going to be responsible for that. So that's why you take antihistamine or allergy medication. Um, Acute allergic responses are going to be the ones that will lead to anaphylactic shock. So if you are someone who carries an EpiPen for a specific allergy, that's an acute allergic response situation. It can be life threatening for some people. Um, any number of things can trigger this for certain people, and there's still a lot of research about like why they happen and is it genetic and all those sorts of deals. But some common ones are bee venom, penicillin, which is a mold and also an antibiotic, peanuts, shellfish, tree nuts. There are many. Pineapple. There's a lot of different common allergens. And allergens and allergies are becoming more and more common, especially in developed countries, which is really interesting. And there may be a connection between like the amount of time you spend outside and like dirty as a child and allergies that are developed. But there's a lot of research being done on it still. All right, last thing is autoimmune diseases. So, in some cases, for some people, the immune system can start to turn on the body or turn on itself. Um, some common autoimmune diseases and disorders are lupus, actually, type 1 diabetes is an example, multiple sclerosis, and rheumatoid arthritis. These can be caused by any number of things, a lot of times a combination of like genes, um, what you got from your parents, which is heredity, and environmental factors. But they can be really unpleasant, and actually can lead to like an early demise. So, a lot of research also being done on autoimmune diseases and how to like prevent and cure them. So, there you go. Okay, like I said, this was a very like general overview of the immune system, by no means comprehensive, but hopefully you learned a little something. Um, if you are interested, I definitely recommend like diving into some videos online. Right now, there's a lot of great like actual like Instagram accounts that are talking about like immunity and how it works. So just get out there and find yourself some info that you like. All right, thanks. See you soon. Bye.